Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Rabbit Trail Podcast. You have just reached our journey of 149. Wait, that's 149. Wait, something. Now I'm all screwed up about the numbers.
Why are you repeating yourself, Greg?
I don't know.
You hate when I repeat it, and now you repeat yourself.
Because I thought it would be funny.
Yeah, there you go.
Anyway, welcome to this episode. And we are,
welcome aboard.
Yes,
welcome
we're
aboard.
glad that you're joining us as well. And as we dive in, this is the Rabbit Trail Podcast, where we chase the truth wherever it runs. And the idea here is that we pick up ideas that come off of our sermons or out of our conversations through the week about the truth of God and His gospel. And so we have a lot of questions we're going to get to today. And so this is going to be a special edition of Q&A, and we're excited about that, aren't we, guys?
We are.
Woo!
I like Q&A.
Yeah. Woo! So my fellow rabbit chasers.
Just be careful when you're excited what you do with your hands.
Oh,
Woo!
Yes. I thought we were going to talk.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
never mind.
Move on.
Yay.
Just a warning.
Yeah. Well, what's that? Who's that warning coming from?
And for those that are in the audience wondering, that is
We're recording this the
not
day
an
after.
inappropriate.
We're just recording this the day after the inauguration, 2 days after the inauguration.
Cool.
So, well, something like that.
Boom.
There was some
those-
guy who made
those-
some excited gestures.
Those who are in the know will know.
Yes. All right. Go ahead and say hi, everybody.
Hi, everybody. My name is Stephen Oldham. I'm the local outreach pastor here at Olive Branch. And if you are watching us, let us know by giving us a thumbs up and subscribe and like this particular one. But more importantly, share it with your friends. And if you can, if you're listening to us on iTunes, let people know you're listening to us. Make sure you subscribe there and let us know. And if you have questions, like today.
Then, yes, I am Brent Branchett. I am the Connections Pastor at Olive Branch Church. And if you have any questions that you want to ask, whether it be life questions, relationship questions, biblical questions, feel free to send them to rabbittrail@obcc.church. Again, email them to rabbittrail@obcc.church.
You're so
we would
soothing today.
love.
Like, I want to play some like soft music behind
doing
you.
ASMR.
Like, I'm just like, oh, yeah. If
Welcome.
you have any questions,
If
we'd love
everybody
to
just
let
could
you know.
take a deep cleansing breath, close your eyes, and imagine a world. You know, well, I don't even remember where that came from. Where
In a
All right.
world.
What, I don't know. It sounds like an intro to something.
It's
but
the movie guy.
yeah.
Yeah, in a world where people are crazy.
So the beginning where you said episode 149 and then repeated yourself. Part of that I think is because you just want me to stop doing that, and so you thought if I do it, then he'll stop. And it kind of just reminded me in high school, in junior high school, when somebody was about to make fun of you. If you jumped ahead and you made fun of yourself first, it took all of that power away from them.
I wish somebody had told me that in high school. That'd be helpful.
And so it just kind of reminded me of that. You know, I know it drives you crazy that I always repeat you still, but
Repetition is flattery. So.
it is. Yeah, there you go.
All right, so where are we going today, Brent? What's going on?
We have a lot of questions today. Thanks to Debbie Redinger, who put 2-3 pages on my desk last week. But also we got quite a few of them coming in through the Rabbit Trail email this week, and I'm really excited for one of them. And we could probably get into that one first.
All the other ones he's not
I'm
excited
excited
about.
for
No.
Nope.
Yeah.
Just the rest of them.
And let me just read.
All one of you.
Let me just restate why I'm excited.
Oh,
Okay.
Because I think they're new to our church, and in her question, she let us know that she was new to the faith. So she emailed a question to the Rabbit Trail. So again, her name is Crystal Lopez. Number one, I'm not sure if you listened to the Rabbit Trail, and so you got that information that you can send in those questions. If so, great. We hope you hope you're listening now as we talk about your question. But we also want to welcome you to the program. Or if she heard that you can email your questions to Rabbit Trail and they will be answered, and so she's expecting a email answer to her questions. So I will be emailing her out to let her know to listen to the podcast, and we discussed it. So welcome, Crystal, and thank you very much for sending in your question. And so we want to hit it right now. And so Crystal Lopez says this: "Hello, Pastor Greg. I'm a new follower and started doing the 6 Weeks with Jesus booklet. I believe probably we did a cookie delivery, of the caramel popcorn to her house because we put that in there.
Oh, sweet.
Upon reading Genesis, I have a few questions. Why did God place Why did God place the forbidden tree? Was this a test for Adam and Eve? Since God knows everything, he had to have known that they were going to eat from it. Why place the temptation? And I'll let you guys get into it in a minute, but one of the first things that hit me when I read this question is this. Was it a test for Adam and Eve? I think it was, and we'll get into why. But why did he place the temptation? And I just want to be clear that tests and temptations are different things. So, a test results an action or a decision, where temptation means that I'm putting evil in front of you to slip you up. And that is not the case with God. He was not trying to tempt them. So.
Yeah, I think the first thing to note is that we love to realize God knows everything, but God has a whole complex of what we would call his attributes that come together. You can't just tease one attribute out of who God is and make that the whole of him. So did God know everything about the scenario? Absolutely. But he also was sovereign. And so this idea of sovereignty needs to be understood as well, in the sense that he is a king, and kings have rules. If you're a ruler, you make rules, kind of like how we do this. Kings make laws and enforce law. Sovereigns are those who do those things. And so if he's the king of the area, and he's the king of the humans, he's going to make a rule. Now, the crazy thing is that at the beginning, God only made one rule and one rule only, which was just don't eat of this tree. In other words, he's like, this is my tree. This is my tree. You don't eat from this tree. You don't touch this tree. And so the tree being in the garden is a function of God, being the ruler. He's going to make boundaries and rules, just like there's gravity and all those other things. These are moral rules. And is there then like a test? Because it's asking them, are you going to follow me? Are you going to listen to me? Are you going to take my lead upon you?
Are you going to remain under my authority?
Right.
Because again, God gave Adam authority over all of creation at that point, right? You have authority over the animals. You have authority over creation. Go and subdue it and rule over it, in a sense. But in the same sense, it's kind of like, I'm giving you all of this autonomy, in a sense, and authority, but here's a reminder of who really is in charge, and are you going to live under my authority? Right?
Yeah. Stephen, you want to add anything to this?
I just think it like an illustration. Oftentimes we think that everything in the Garden of Eden was presented as God sharing his authority in many ways with people, but we don't want to disavow the fact that God was also it's his property, it's his ownership, and he's allowed to have things. And so for what reason would God want to put a tree in the garden? Well, there could be many reasons, but I think of it similar to if there's a car in your garage and you have a 5-year-old and there's the keys and you say, we don't touch the keys and get in the car, and the kid's not able to comprehend why. It's a trust relationship at that point, that I know what's important for you, and do you trust me? And if at some point the neighbor kid comes over and says like, oh, your parents are just trying to make you not have a fun time, right? So you really want to be like your dad. You need to get into the car, drive it away. You could see real easily why a parent doesn't necessarily always have the ability at the time of a person to say why they need to do certain things, A or B, but he is saying to the child, you need to trust me as your parent. You need to trust that I know what's best for you, and what's best for you now is that you do not do this. And so for me, that's similar to what's going on in the Garden of Eden. It is a test, in some sense, of the trust that you have in your parent or authority to follow their guide.
But I think her question's even more fundamental. It's like, okay, say we grant that. Well, then why would God make it at all in the first place? And the answer, again, I think, is because he is sovereign, and because he is the ruler. There's going to be a rule. There's going to be something that is going to set the limits on human autonomy, because he's God and they're not.
Right.
Now, there isn't something interesting about this, that this tree isn't some kind of magical thing. Because if the tree actually does something to you, then it would be like a temptation at that point. But it's actually the fact that God set the rule and said, this is my tree. It made it into the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Some scholars would actually argue that it's just a normal tree. What makes that tree different was God said it's my tree. And if they were to disobey, they would have this is the tree of experiencing good and evil. There's another way that you could practically translate the word yada in the
To know.
It's like this intimacy with the thing so that you own it. It's yours. It's experienced. And so God doesn't want them to experience evil. God doesn't want them to experience, he wants them to just trust him and live in that trust because that is good. But the second they would disobey is the second they would come to know good and evil.
Yeah.
There's no implication that they don't know the good. It's just that they wouldn't know the evil. And so now it becomes the knowledge, the intimacy of good and evil, the distinction, because evil will have come up because they've disobeyed God.
I also
And
think,
what do you think about the idea that they knew good, right? I mean, there's no doubting the fact that they knew good because God declared it good when it was done, and it is very good. What do you think of the idea that you can't truly understand good apart from evil? Like, if it's good, you know what? I'm not sure if I'm voicing this clearly, but I don't know how good is until I know what evil is, right? I mean, you could be involved in something like, I mean, if you just do food, right? Or even like a marriage. You might be in a really good marriage, but think, there's better. So you leave something good, or you're eating a food that you think is good, and then you try something really good, like you're eating Brussels sprouts, right? Thinking these are good. And then you have a nice juicy steak, and then all of a sudden the Brussels sprouts are nasty. I'm being silly, but you know what I'm saying? Is you have good.
Well, the problem
but you
is
don't understand how good you have it.
No, again, you're going back to, I think that's the temptation, actually. You're playing the serpent's game at that point. Is like, you can't know good without the evil. Well, Jesus knew good.
Jesus is good without evil.
Jesus is good without evil. So God knew it perfectly, but he doesn't need to know the evil. You just need to know the good. The fact that we have to discern what is good now is how evil we are. Like, and we can't use food and stuff because we're talking about morals. Like, we're not talking about tastes. Like, we're not talking about health. These are different concepts. Like, health is good for you, or it could be bad for you, but that we can't even really necessarily define all that very well. It's just because we're always trying to say we don't want to die. Well, that's a consequence of the fall, not a consequence of what you're eating. You're gonna die. You could be the most healthy person. I mean, how many super healthy people have been on their run and they're like, and they conk over and dead. Like, all the people who are like 100 years old are like, I drank rum and smoked cigarettes until I was forever single day and never saw a doctor. And you're like, that's not why you're 100 years old. It's like, that's not how that works. All that rant right there is just to go back to, we're talking morally good and evil. And the morally good exists in and of itself and is intrinsically understood and known. It was the introduction to evil, the rejection of the good, that has made us into a quagmire of not clear. We're now confused. What were you going to say, Stephen?
I was going to say that I do believe this is a kind of a test that comes with the will to truly obey God. It has to be an act of the ability, not the fact that you remove all obstacles. I think this is a problem with a lot of parenting in some sense. They don't want their kids to have anything around them that might tempt them. And I get that in some sense. But if they're never able to choose good because you've removed any opposite from them, are they truly freely doing it because they're in a relationship with you or because they trust you? And I don't know if that's true. That's why I said it. Sometimes you have to we had this situation where when Josiah was young, he had a couple friends that we thought were a negative influence. But instead of saying, no, you can't do A, B, or C, they were in a safe environment, like the Garden of Eden. They were in school, and there's a lot of Christians here. We wanted him to navigate through that friendship and ask lots of questions. And he'll discover on his own whether that's a good friend or not. But I don't want to say, no, you can't do that, because I'm taking away his ability to think and reason through why is that a good God? Why is that a loving God? Why is that the right thing to do? And I think a lot of people do that. And I think what's going on there in Garden of Eden is I'm putting this there to test the trust here between us, and
to give you a choice,
to give you the real choice. If he doesn't give you the real choice and removes all the obstacles, this is why parenting to me is about putting some obstacles that are not so out of the danger that allow your child to choose what is good. You really don't want to wait till college and then you throw them into the lion's den to be like, okay, now we're going to hope that the lions don't eat you, and because you have to give them, like, they have to see their friends make different choices. If you remove that friend making bad choices sometimes, and you do this with discernment. I'm not saying this is every situation, because I was brought up the wrong way in some senses where I could do almost anything I wanted, but that did teach me growing up, like, hey, I don't want to do these things I see other people doing.
So the one thing I thought was interesting too, and I just want to point it out here, is when you were saying, Greg, that to choose the good and not choose the evil. One of the things I think is interesting is if you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, and compare it to Genesis chapter 3, verse 5. And I just, the descriptions. And God, out of the ground, the Lord God made spring up every tree. And every tree is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil was there too. Okay, and then you skip over to chapter 3 on verse 6. So, and this is like the serpent already tempted her. And so it says, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eye. And to me, that states that the tree of good and evil was no different than any other tree, kind of like what you were saying. They were both pleasant to the sight. They were both good for food. So it says, when she saw that it was good for food and there was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, or to make one like God, as the serpent tempted her. So again, I think that was the opportunity to choose what is good, because I think what the serpent did in the garden was put a seed in their mind that
God wasn't good.
God is not good. You think he's good, but he's withholding this from you, because once you take this, then you are going to be like God. And he's kind of, figurative speaking, he's trying to keep you down. He's a man trying to keep you down. And so the desire to be like God and to usurp God or be equal with God and break that authority line was really what made the tree of good and evil.
Right. And that's critical. What you just hit on is the most critical aspect, because if you stop and think about this, how petty is God? You ate from my tree. I curse all of humanity.
Forever.
And I got to have my son die on a cross. Like, that's the most cynical take, right? That's actually the point. The point is, you think your lie isn't condemnatory to hell because it's just a lie. It was just a piece of fruit. No, it's not what you do. It's the heart condition of rejecting God's rule over your life. It's a breaking of relationship. It is a legitimate rebellion against God to take on your own leadership and desire. And so you got to get past even the tree stuff to see that this is a very simple thing. It's far deeper, has far more contours to do with what you're talking about, that it's this, you're rejecting God's rule. Even a simple rule as that, we can't handle it. We're going to go against it. And so the question then goes back to her last part, which is like, well, if God knew, why'd he put it there? And we could say, it's a test, it's this. But I want to say it this way, that was, when we think about God's omniscience, his knowing everything, I want you to consider that when God knows everything, he is certain of what our choices are going to be. And that's what we mean by knowing something in the future. He is certain we will choose something. He doesn't make us choose it, and he doesn't force us into the choice, but he is certain we will choose that. Now that means if he is certain of a choice, the choice has to be truly offered. And so he has to create that tree, and he has to create that opportunity for him to be certain about what's going to happen, or there's no certainty about the situation. There's no choice.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, and I mean, although it's a bad analogy, which I am I am always happy to throw out bad analogies. It really
Bad
reminds me
analogy,
of
Brent.
my youngest daughter. She was the type that was kind of strong-willed and stubborn, and her room was a shambles, you know. And so I would tell her, like on a Saturday, I want you to go up and I want you to clean your room, you know. And so she would go up and stomp up the stairs because she had to clean her room. And then she would just sit in the filth of her room for hours and hours, you know. And I always told her, if you did it, it would take you 45 minutes and then you could go out and play with your friends, right? But she was always that stubborn. And so I would send her up there. She'd be up there for like an hour and a half. And then I would just kind of quietly walk up the stairs to check on her. And my wife always thought that was so mean of me. Why do you want to go up there and catch her not doing what she's supposed to do just so you can get mad at her? And I would tell my wife, no, I'm hoping to catch her doing what she's supposed to do. You know, I walked up those stairs knowing that she wasn't doing what she's supposed to do, but I wanted to catch her.
When he was young, he's matured since, but when he was young, it didn't matter what we were going to do. But we knew that if we were going to say we're going to go do something, he would throw a fit because it was going to be his biggest. It was just going to be a nightmare. Everything he wasn't planned for it was going to be horrible. So we're literally getting a chance as a family. The church is sending us to Disneyland, and we're like all excited. We get in the car, we're taking him there, and I'm like certain I'm going to tell them we're going to Disneyland, and my kids are going to erupt, and he was going to throw a fit. But just because I was certain of it didn't mean I wasn't going to do it. And sure enough, I told him, and he threw a fit about having to go to Disneyland because he wasn't prepared to go to Disneyland that day. And so it's just like, but you know, I also knew that I was certain that when we ended, he would be the one who had the most fun, and he would be talking about it the most, and he fit the pattern perfectly because I know him and I'm certain of what it was like. And guess what? None of that would have happened if we said, you know, that kid's not going to want to, he's going to throw a fit and not want to go. We should just not take him. But that wouldn't be the case. I had to give him the chance.
Also, it's in the Bible for a reason as well, because I think these tests also reveal to us some of the choices that we make. That I don't know if people, especially children, would have known that they would have done that. Every time you're like, it reveals something about your heart. It reveals something about your trust. It reveals something about your loyalty. I think this is why, I think it was Paul that says, like, I want to be found loyal. I want to be found doing the right thing when God is speaking on me to do the right thing. But you don't even know that unless somehow you're tested to see how strong that is from time to time. And so sometimes the tests are also good for us. It's good for us to know what we would do in a given scenario, because it reveals, are you going to press in, or are you going to press out? Are you going to sow more distrust, or are you going to lean in and ask for forgiveness? And you wouldn't necessarily know that. A lot of people think, well, I'm an A student. Well, have you ever taken a test? No. Well, how do you know? Well, I just think so. You know, like, there are things that you need to be presented to you to be tested in order to reveal parts of your heart that you think you know. And I think God knows us better. And I think sometimes even failing a test is learning. It's falling forward and then making a choice. Do I want to press in or pull away? And unfortunately for Adam and Eve, they pulled away. And I don't know what would have happened if they pressed in.
And I will say, you know, Crystal, as we're answering this question too, we appreciate the question. We appreciate, and I mean, I think at some point in our walks, we've all asked that question. Yep. You know, oh, yeah. So I'm not trying to single you out, but I think to some degree, when we read this story, we almost villainize God for putting the tree there instead of villainizing Adam and Eve for partaking in it and
or
disobeying.
Or the serpent for tempting them.
And that was kind of the purpose of my story about my daughter. Was my wife kind of made me out to be the villain for going upstairs to check on her to see if she was doing what she was doing. When the villainous act really was her not doing what she was supposed to be doing.
It's a twist. Oh.
You know, and so it's like, you know, so looking back on it now, I'm like, yeah, I mean, I do kind of feel like I was presented as the villain for going and checking up on her. And in my heart, you know, I knew that she wasn't. So I was walking up the stairs disappointed most of the time with expectation of disappointment. But if I could have just caught her doing good, you know, it would have made my heart happy, you know. So it wasn't solely to go up there and punish her. It was really to kind of catch her doing good. And I do feel like we kind of villainize God in that regard. And so part of it is God's character is always good, even when mankind is not. And I think we run through the same scenarios when we look at evil in the world and question, how could God be loving? You know, how could God be loving and allow this evil to continue? How can God? So instead of, you know, maybe keeping God at an arm's length when we're asking those questions, is really go in and understand, how can such a beautiful, wonderful, perfect, graceful, you know, heart, you know, be patient with the evil that is going on in the world, you know? And
all right. No, I hope that helps. And
Yeah,
I
if
hope that
it muddies it up, let us know with another question.
yeah.
we can muddy it up even further.
All right. So so Tommy Lucia, yay Tommy. He asked a question. This kind of goes back to Christmas. Although I just got the question today or this week. So his question is, when the Magi, and although the Bible never says there were three wise men, people always refer to the Magi as the three wise men. So when the Magi came to worship Jesus when he was born, do you think they knew who he really was that they were worshiping, or do you think they just came to celebrate a new prophesied king that they heard about from some Jews in Persia or Babylon? So I would imagine he's asking, do you think they really knew that he was Christ, the Messiah had come, or, you know, he was simply just going to be a king, you know, in Israel at some point? So did they come to honor him as the Christ and the Messiah, or a king that was born, an earthly king?
Well, I think first of all, we need to understand that you zip back far enough that this idea of a Magi really looks like it's coming out of it's coming out of out of Persia, right? So you have this concept of in the book of Daniel, you kind of get these Magi-like people. I believe it's the Septuagint that uses the term. Let me double check that. So, because if it's the Septuagint that's speaking that way, then you're really going to be you're really seeing the link, because they would have been thinking, oh, Magi come from where Daniel was. And let's just assume that's where it's at right now until I can double check it. That means that they likely would have known Daniel's prophecies. And there was regardless of whether or not, if they came from the Babylonian area, the Persian area of Assyria, they've been conquered by Greeks and all this stuff, then they would have wound up in a situation where they knew all the prophecies. Many people believe that the way the Old Testament finally came together occurred, really finally was brought together into one full document that we would understand as the scrolls in the way the Tanakh of the Old Testament in Babylon. So this area, in Babylonia, whatever you want to call it, is actually a place that was filled with an understanding of this idea of a coming Messiah. So when you get some pagan astrologers who were once led by a guy who named Daniel, who was over the magicians and the enchanters and the sorcerers and all that kind of stuff, the Magos, the Magi, you know, and we end up with honestly an opportunity to see that they probably would have been understanding that future king was coming. Now, they look at the stars and they see a certain alignment of stars of some kind, and there's some different debates about what those stars were, and they go, that king is born. And they get up and they start marching, and they come into. They didn't know that it wasn't Herod. They thought, oh, it's probably in Jerusalem. It's probably where Herod is. So they go there expecting maybe Herod to have a son or something like that, but that doesn't happen. So instead, they go outside. They find the star again. They know it's supposed to be in Bethlehem. They go there, and they fall down and worship him. Why do they worship? Well, it's really interesting, but there is no kings or Caesars since the time of the Babylonians, really, who didn't declare themselves at some level God, especially in Persia. The Persian kings were thought of as gods on earth. They were god kings. And so when they know a Jewish king is here, I think that they are acting in their Gentileness to worship this baby born the king of the Jews as a god. The only crazy thing is Jesus is the only god king that's ever truly existed. And so they were right. And so did they know that Jesus was God? No. Did they think he was? They thought he was some kind of god, and they knew he was the king of the Jews because they were told by the star and by that, but they wouldn't have known. Maybe they would have some inkling about like this is a future Messiah kind of figure, but all we're told is that they believed that was a king of the Jews had been born, and that seems to indicate that they came and worshipped him because that's what you do to a king. So that seems. Did they know that he was going to save the world? No, they didn't. I don't think it doesn't seem to give us any of that assumption in the text.
Yeah, I mean, the story is using them as an idea that the world is acknowledging that there's a supernatural event occurring in Jerusalem that brings about a king that's going to save people. The question, and then there's no specificity like on what happened. There's some tradition as to what happens to them after, but there's no specificity other than they return to their home. But I would say, who knows what Mary's and Joseph's conversation was with them, filling in maybe some of the gaps.
Could they even speak to them? We're not even sure. Maybe by Greek.
Well, maybe by Greek.
But they're not from the Roman Empire.
They're not. So if they could communicate, I mean, they had to have come in some way. It's possible they could have been told by Joseph and Mary. But I think that sometimes we want to know what happens to specific individuals in the story because we're curious, and I think that's great. But sometimes the story is using them to focus to Christ, and that feels kind of like, oh, they're not. They are people in the story, but oftentimes just having something that's so far out off the radar that it has to be a supernatural event, that this happens at all, that a bunch of pagan people are recognizing the birth of this Messiah figure, is the kind of point that I think that even says even the Gentiles need to pay attention to who this king is. And so I think that's what you get from what the story wants you to get from it. The other questions are always cool and interesting to ask, but we don't always get all of those answers. So
yeah, just to clarify, yes, Magos, which is what the wise men is translated as, the word is Magos. That shows
Magus,
up
yeah.
in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, in Daniel 2:2 and Daniel 2:10. The king commanded to bring in the enchanters and the Magos, the Magi, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, declare the king his dreams, and when they were present, they stood in the presence of the king, and included in that was Daniel, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So all of them were all part of this entourage of Magi, enchanters, sorcerers. They were all trained up in this same kind of
advisors
advisory kind of magical advisory kind of people.
So were you saying that Mary and Joseph would have spoke Greek?
It would have been the lingua franca, right?
Yeah,
they would have had to have learned to speak Greek.
It would Greek and Aramaic is most likely. They would probably know a little bit of Hebrew, maybe.
I think they do, but that's debatable.
Yeah, it would be interesting because that was a pretty obscure. Hebrew was really for the scholarly. It was for the the people, the scribes.
Of common language.
No, Hebrew.
Not
it was
Aramaic. Aramaic is the common language.
Oh, wow.
That's what they're talking to each other in every day.
Jesus
but when a Roman soldier comes up,
so when the Magi got there and they were like, what are they saying? And the other Magi said, I don't know. It's all Greek.
I imagine the Magi probably spoke several languages.
Well, and that's the thing. The Magi probably spoke a form of Aramaic, since that's what the lingua franca was from Persia,
earlier on, before the Roman Empire.
So they probably could have communicated, but it would have been different. So,
all right.
Well, they were able, and they were also able to communicate with Herod and the priests and the scribes.
You're right.
They would have had to been able to speak enough to have that detail of the story. So
All right, and then Paul Martin sent in a question.
Paul.
Hello, Paul. And he said, in this week's message, and I don't know if that was probably, I don't know if that was this last week or the week before, but
That was this week.
okay. In this week's message, Greg mentioned sharing your story, like the blind man who was blind but could then see in Luke 9.
That's John 9.
That's John 9.
Just mistyped.
While that can be great for people who were saved later in life, what about those who became Christians when they were very young and grew up in the church without falling away? What should their story sound like? First off, I would say number one, I do feel that there is a thought in many people who grew up in Christian homes, were good kids, for their whole life, never really went off the rails and started shooting heroin or drinking and doing drugs. And they feel like they don't have a testimony, and they're hearing all these people with all these exciting testimonies about how they were living in the gutter and God swept them up and redeemed them. And now they're living, I think that the fact that somebody grew up in a home and understood God, because I didn't grow up in a Christian home. I did grow up in a good home, a moral home, but I didn't grow up in a Christian home. And I look back and I wish I would have grown up in a home where my parents were Christ followers. My dad was a spiritual mentor in my life. And I just wonder how different my life would be. I don't think that, another example is like, I don't think if you got married, you were in love with your high school sweetheart, you spent your whole life together, had a blissful, happy marriage, that you would sit there and think, I have nothing to share about life, a married life, because we didn't.
I had dated 17 women and slept around.
If only we had an affair. If only if we had an affair in our marriage and we overcame that, then I could say. I grew up in a Christian home. I didn't go off the rails, so I don't have a testimony of basically God's grace and mercy and forgiveness in my life. I would just caution you to think that maybe you think too lightly of sin. Maybe your sin wasn't shooting heroin and drinking and partying and fornicating around, but like Greg said earlier, just a lie is enough of a sin to condemn you to damnation for eternity. So I would say that maybe we take sin too lightly to think that we don't have a testimony of redemption.
Well, I think I wouldn't take it that way as much. I mean, there might be people out there who struggle that way, but I think that the vast majority of people haven't stopped long enough who are like, my wife's one of those people who's grown up in the church and just like she struggled for years. Like, I don't really feel like I have a testimony. And so I would ask her like, okay, well, where do you think you would have gone had Christ not been in your life? Because that's what you were spared from. That's your testimony. And I agree with you. Like, man, I love that my kids have a testimony of like, I got to know the Lord when I was young and He has been faithful to me all these years, and I was spared all these things. Like, that's what I wish I had, right? I don't know anybody who's got the amazing testimony that we call an amazing testimony that doesn't go, I wish I had yours. Honestly, everybody I know is like, I wish I'd grown up. I wish I hadn't had to go through any of that stuff. I wish I had the way that you got. I wish I had the parents you got brought up with. I wish I'd, that kind of stuff. I mean, Stephen, you have a similar testimony in the sense of like,
I've been a Christian since I was 5. I don't know about raising in a Christian home off and on. I had different, parents and stuff. But to me, I would say that the hard thing for people to grasp is the way in which we sometimes ask people to share their testimonies. We often want to we often like drama, and we often like the dramatic, and so it is dramatic. It is eye-catching when someone comes up and goes, I used to do this, now I do that, because that's encouraging for people. The problem is when we think that's the only thing a witness or a testimony is. And originally it was like a thing you would say is, what can you testify about the truth? What do you know? And in this sense, the guys didn't know very much when we're talking about the passage. Right. This is all I know. Mm-hmm. But if you've been a Christian your whole life, that shouldn't be all that you know. And for me, I had to realize this, that they're asking for one, and I don't mind having those testimonies. I really enjoy them. But that doesn't mean I don't have a testimony. And so you end up having to think, why am I a Christian? Why is it? What has God done for me in my life? What is he doing in my life? What would I be without him? And that, I think, is what people think of when they're in a long-lasting relationship. I can't imagine how bad it would be if this wasn't currently the situation I'm experiencing. I have this good relationship. Wow, what a blessing. So it's kind of like I can testify to the blessing. I can testify to the fact it has always been comforting to know that in my darkest moments, there's this Spirit of God living inside of me. Be tempted the way everyone in the room is tempted. There's just something in me that's saying, that's not a good idea. I see your future. This is not right. It doesn't mean I don't see that temptation. I know exactly what I would do because I just watched people do it. I can't make them stop. I would pray for them and stuff, but like I watched my high school friends do drugs. I watched people do all these things. And I can't tell you that the only reason I didn't do those things is because of what the Lord has taught me. That's not fruitful. That's not going to lead to something good. That's not beneficial. And to forget that you have that voice in your head, I think is just to be so familiar with it, you don't realize what the blessing is that you do have. And so I'd encourage people to start thinking about the times in your life when you knew that you would not make those choices, because we all have general temptations. And when you do, it is attached to sins. Like I know if I didn't have the Spirit living in me or the instructions from my mom at certain points or other Christians, that I would have followed different paths. And the fact that I didn't is a blessing, and it's something I can testify to. And I can actually look at certain points in my life where I would have gone differently. Like if that temptation was brought to me and I didn't have this instruction from the Word or from God in my life showing me these things, I'd definitely fall for lots of things. We're all susceptible to the flesh, and the fact that the Spirit has been with me longer should be more of a testimony. It's like, why are you a Christian? I totally believe this thing. and what helped me with clarify this was someone just got saved that was in one of the groups, and he's like, there's like another voice in my head that wasn't there before, and it's like saying, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. And I'm like, oh, that's the Spirit provoking your conscience, right? Growing in that knowledge is what makes life livable. I don't know how you live without that. I don't ever want to lose sight of the fact that that's a being, that there's a Holy Spirit inside of me, and to rejoice with that Spirit, to be happy that it's there. It's hard when you've been a Christian for a long time because you get used to it. And I think that's what you see in the prodigal son. The one son went out and did a bunch of stuff, but the other son's like, I've been here the whole time. He goes, yeah, are you forgetting that you have an inheritance? Look
it's
around
all yours.
You. It's all yours. Look around. And he's like, oh, okay. So that's the testimony that I think those have been Christian a long time. And to take light of it is to assume that you would have done it without the Holy Spirit. So I don't want to get to a point where I've been a Christian, I'm so familiar with the Spirit's voice that I take for granted that was given to me.
So that's one of the testimonies lines that I've heard from someone was, I think it was Ruth Graham or it was Billy Graham's wife. I don't remember which one said it. She said, I don't know when the sun started shining. I just know that he always has been. And that's kind of been her one line that she would share with people. It's like, I don't know when he started, but he's just always been present. There's other aspects. I think that I remember there's a missionary in Indonesia, and he would meet other people from these states and stuff who would say, oh, I'm a Christian. He'd say, awesome. And then his first question was, when did you come to the realization that you are a sinner destined for hell? And if they were like, what? He's like, you need to double check yourself. Like, do you really believe this? Have you really come to the realization of your need for Jesus? Like, he would re-evangelize people because they just really didn't think that they deserved hell. I think that is a danger of someone who grows up in the church that they look at the people and they go like, well, I haven't done anything deserving of hell, and we got to go, like you were saying, we take sin lightly.
Your need for a savior is more horizontal than it is vertical.
Right. And it's like, and there would be questions like, what has he kept you from? Like when you finally came to realize, oh, I needed him, what was it that provoked that? And that's what you can begin to go like, oh, that's what he saved me from. Yeah, well, that's where he's leading me from. Like there's this rebellion I have in my heart, and I was a rebel, but now I'm his. There's lines you can come up with. I can't tell you what that line would be, but I believe everybody has something that they can lean on and go like, this is what God did, because we're all sinners saved by grace.
Now, is there any truth to the fact that, like Teresa, she's growing up in a Christian home, in a very prayer-heavy home, and she didn't really fall off the tracks, that she prayed that God would just bring great difficulty into her life, and that's when you dropped to your knees and proposed to her? Is there any truth to that?
There's some truth to but no, she's actually, for the, kind of come to this same realization, Stephen, that you said. It's like she knows what she was spared from.
Oh, yeah.
Like she praises God that she didn't have to go through certain things because God's presence was always with her. She doesn't carry certain baggage. And I think you have to grasp that, because when you realize how much you've been given, you love more. Those who've been given much love much. It's not just those who've been forgiven much love much. When you realize how much you were given, man, there is more required, I think, of some people who have been given that opportunity. You just get an awesome chance to lay out a life that you're like, he's just always been there. And I can tell you may not realize it, but he's real, and I've known him all of my life.
If you've been given much, you love much, or you become entitled much.
You can.
I would say too, for those who have parents or who have young kids who gave their life to the Lord at a young age, I wouldn't think that they had to know like the full concepts of heaven and hell sometimes. I realized for me that there's never a time in my life where I didn't think there was a God. There was a time in my life where I knew that I was a sinner, but it wasn't as deep as when I got older and knew even more. I think sometimes it's a subtle revelation as to the human condition, as to how much you would be, especially when you hit puberty. But there's times in your life where you realize, I know that Jesus died for my sins, and I know that I'm not a good person. And that's what I understood at 5, and then I needed his acceptance on the cross. Later on, I felt out, okay, this rebellious nature in my heart is enough to rebel against God and cause me in eternity to be a complete and utter enemy of the Lord. And you realize that as you see yourself wanting to sin, or as you've sinned, because Christians sin. That's not a revelation for many people. We do sin, and God does come and tell us, I died for this. And you're like, I realize that now. And there are times in my life where I've sinned and come back to the Lord, and he's forgiven me, and I don't deserve that. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's like, okay, I know what my heart would do if I didn't have the Spirit living with me. I know where it would head. And the fact that he's even willing to wrestle with me is a good thing. So,
and so I think we're just trying to, Paul, we're not trying to say that you don't know what the Lord saved you from or any of that stuff. That's not, we're just kind of
giving different
general
through this stuff. And because there's different ways that we all as human sinners can fall, you can struggle with these things when we've been raised in a home. Yeah, it can go bad directions too. And so as Pastor Ike used to say, who planted the church, just because you come to church doesn't mean you're a Christian. Just because you're sitting in a garage doesn't make you a car, right? That kind of thing. But I think that for us, it's just we're trying to wrestle through it with you, because it is something that is so prized and precious and good that your story that you have, I want you to value it like crazy, because man, I think Brent and I would both say, yeah, that's what we wish we had. And I don't know too many people. I don't know anybody who isn't like, okay, yeah, my story, God uses it, but man, I would have rather had yours. I would, if I could have had a longer journey with Jesus and spared so much of these things, like that would be so different.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and when I said that, given much, you love much. Given much, you can be entitled much.
Forgiven much.
I know it is forgiven much, and I know you were playing on that, but when I said like entitled much, I just remember a conversation with my dad, who wasn't a believer at the time. And, he had a pretty good life, middle class life, when us kids were growing up. We didn't have everything, but we didn't feel like we were really left without. And relationally, the family was good and all this stuff. And, my dad, when I was trying to talk to him about God, I mean, his idea was, I don't need God. Look at everything I have. My life is good. I've got a good life, And so because his life was good, he didn't see a need for God. And I said, well, Dad, part of it is, most of your family now are Christians, so you're kind of living under the umbrella of that grace. But also, God has graced you, with a house and cars and blah, blah, blah. My dad's like, nah, I worked hard for that stuff. I busted my butt, every day at work. And I said, but Dad, God gave you the strength in your bones to be able to work. He put the air in your lungs to wake you up every day, and so that you could work, for the privilege of work. And I do feel like that's what I mean by that entitlement aspect, is that I'm taking credit for everything that goes on in my life, and not really understanding how much grace has been given me,
And indeed, there are some people out there that probably do that. But I think, again, it's just I envy that. That, and it's the testimony I want to give my kids, right? Yeah. But that's the testimony I want my children to have. So
again, to just kind of beret the point, but it's like, if you're on your third marriage, you wouldn't go, oh, what I wouldn't give to have my first marriage work out and have a healthy relationship with my kids and everything else my whole life, instead of all that broken and baggage and everything else.
It's more like, it's more like you meet that if the third marriage is really good and healthy, it's like, wow, why didn't I find you first?
Or why wouldn't I the person?
Or why wouldn't I the person?
Doing the things that made this work. So, I don't think anybody would go, I'm glad that I went through
now
two
that
divorces.
We've ticked off every person who's been raised in church, and you guys have awesome testimonies. And
for those of you that have lived in a Christian home, grew up as a Christian your whole life, and didn't really go off the rails, we just sit here and question whether or not you're really saved.
Well, so you say that, but you say that, but that did happen on a date. The person was like, when did you give your life to the Lord? I said, well, I was 5. And they go, really? Yeah. I was like, what? Yeah. You just disavow.
You gave your life.
You can't have that as your testimony.
That as your testimony. I was like, oh, okay.
All right. Ouch. So now to some of Debbie's questions.
That date went well.
So some of Debbie's questions. She's Genesis 8. So Debbie says, did God flood the entire earth or the earth they knew? If it was the whole earth, how did animals repopulate when oceans divided the lands? So, that's not a bad question in the sense that, with Noah's Ark, 2 by 2, and we know that there's some, micro evolution that goes on in animals, but there are animals on some continents that are really only indigenous to that continent, like horses, for example. Horses, I don't think, are indigenous at all to North or South America or anything. I think they came from Europe somewhere, and so how did they get over here? So there is that difficulty in that text. So did God flood the entire earth, or just where they were?
So this is a very, very big subject. I'm still doing more of my own personal research on the flood and the story and the narrative and all that kind of stuff. I'm better at the early Genesis stuff, and then you get to the Noah stuff, and it is a complicated question, because there's kind of in theology two packages that it comes in, and you've kind of laid them out. One is what they call a global total flood, where everything, every animal, every creature, everything dies. And only the creatures with Noah and on the ark and his family, they're the only ones that survive. The other one is called not a local. People like to go, oh, that's a local flood theory. It's not a local flood theory. It's called a universal flood theory. And the universal flood theory is that it was universal to mankind. Wherever man was,
That's what the local flood was.
The flood killed off all the creatures and humanity around men. And so humanity would all have been died. And the only animals that would have been saved in this catastrophic event that's too large for you to sail across and get to the other side and that kind of stuff, because there's no sails on the ark. There's no oars. There's none of that stuff. It's just bobbing along on top of this massive floodwaters. So even when they say people go, local, they could have just gone to the edge and gotten away. No, that's not the idea. The idea is a universal flood that is so grand, so great, it destroys all of human civilization at the time, no matter where it was. So that could have been global, that could be regional, it could be, but it's definitely,
especially since no one was actually going out and being fruitful. Oftentimes you see in the narratives they're clustering together when they're supposed to be going out.
Now the difficulty is in the text. So you get this situation in Genesis chapter 6 where humanity is just messed up. There seems to be this weird stuff going on with these Nephilim things that we're not going to talk about right now because they're
long enough for a whole podcast.
Yeah, that's a very, very long conversation in of itself. And then you get this wickedness of humankind becomes so great that every inclination of their thoughts and their minds were evil all the time. So God is repentant that he's regretting that he made them. It says, I will wipe out humankind whom I have created from the face of the earth, everything from humankind to animals, including creatures that move on the ground, the birds of the air, for I regret that I have made them. So he makes a declaration he's going to decreate the world, which is how you would read this.
Yeah.
And in a decreation, you would assume that he's decreating it all. It's all going back to primordial chaos, which is the concept of the flood. That it would be global in nature. There would be nothing left of creation, and then he'll reset the creation. Hits the Nintendo reset button, boom. The Mario level's gone, and it comes back from its darkness. So that's the first kind of side. The second thing is the universality on which it keeps saying that all the flesh, all things, all flesh, all animals, all flesh, all animals, seems to indicate that this seems like it's a total flood, like a complete global catastrophe. And so, and the rain's falling and the deeps are opening. And so all this stuff's going on. So reading it as earth, which is how you'll find it translated, is difficult because the word earth is actually the word eretz. And eretz can be described as the land,
the
soil, or the earth.
They don't have you'd have to assume they knew a global concept.
Right.
Which is, you'd have to make that argument. Most people, when they're using it, mean, as far as the eye can see, the flat stuff.
Right. It is really wherever you find people.
Yeah.
The known world.
Right.
And so some scholars argue that you should translate this as that he's going to, so the Lord God said, I will wipe humankind whom I have created from the face of the known world, would be another, from the face of the land. Everything from humankind to animals, including creatures that move on the ground, which is not the same word, birds of the air, and for I regret that I have made them. And so this idea of the earth, the eretz, is this, concept of the land, the concept of the known territory that man had spread out to. So that's the debate. And is she asking us to take a side, or is she just asking us, how to read it, or?
Did the flood enter entire Earth or just the Earth? They knew if the whole Earth, how did animals repopulate when oceans divided the lands?
So you're asking more of a science question there, right?
Okay. Do you want to tackle any of this?
Oh, I would just say a couple things. One, I love the idea of speculation on different, what you call models of how certain things would work scientifically. But sometimes it's good to know we are asking a science question when you're asking the last part of the question, which was about
how did the animals repopulate?
How did the animals repopulate? This is a question people ask when they ask how many animals are on the ark, because DNA-wise, there's not enough animals to repopulate the number of species that we have, so you couldn't trace them all back to an ark. These are all interesting speculations that I don't mind people exploring, but I don't think that's what the text is concerned about. If you were an ancient person living at this time and you're looking at it, you would have thought, okay, God is not pleased. He's decreating all of what creation has because of what they've done. He's gonna reset the world, and that's what they're seeing. And for them, they didn't ask the question, what about the people in China? Because they didn't know they existed. So everything they see, all of the people they know that ever existed in that area are the ones that are wiped out, and God is starting over with Adam and Eve. And that's really...
No, you mean Noah.
I mean Noah. Like Noah is like a new Adam and Eve. So he's like starting all over and creating some things so that's to establish a new order so that God can bring about the promised seed out of Noah and the family. And now anything other than that, I think you can ask these questions. I think they're wonderful. But I don't think whatever you come up with, because I can come up with several different scenarios that work, would alter the fact that this is a possibility, especially when you start to think of primordial history. We start looking at the history of all these ancient cultures. They all have a story like this. So you're asking, well, how is that possible? Well, that's more of a detailed scientific response, and there are many people who do this well, who attempt to do that, whether it's global or local. But just know that I wouldn't require someone to hold one position or the other, because I don't think either of them violate the text. And so they're asking me about opinion. That would just be me speculating based on how I look at science, or how I look at geography, geology, age of the earth testing and measures, and it would be an educated guess, but it wouldn't necessarily violate the text. If someone came to a different conclusion, was able to fit some kind of scientific worldview into that, we would argue more over the science or the history than we would about the text.
So 3 things. Number one, basically all over the world, ancient civilizations have a flood story. So, there's speculation where, okay, is global flood, or, is it verbal passed on from the survivors? And so everybody marked down that as a historical standpoint. So where are some good references where they could go back and either read or watch on YouTube or something, people discussing that thing? Also, Greg kind of went over the Nephilim. There was a question as well, and we talked about it, and we decided we weren't really going to discuss it today because, number one, it would be a big, long subject. Number two, we've discussed it a couple of times already on the podcast, probably 3 times. But also, like Heiser, would he be a good resource to get more information on the Nephilim?
I don't mind if we go and talk about it. I think just me and Greg want to kind of present different options, even ones
that... We're going to get all of our stuff lined out. It's just a very complicated conversation.
Because there is a traditional view, and then there's one that's less traditional but still falls within. And I want to be fair to both of those views. And and so I just want to make sure, at least for me, I want to make sure, I don't speak for Greg, but I want to make sure my ducks are in a row,
right?
That I can kind of really articulate it so it doesn't go too long.
And then thirdly, she asks, how did the animals repopulate when the oceans divided the lands? So number one, is there any truth in the sense that as the waters tried to receive, because we see that there are animals on different continents that don't exist anywhere else. And so is it true that Noah, as the waters receded, kind of became a cruise director and like, okay, koalas and kangaroos get off here at Australia and then go to Africa. Hippopotamuses and rhinoceroses get off here along with, is there any truth to that?
No.
No.
Just kidding.
Oh. I thought I just hit the origins of the cruise lines.
One thing I could do, and I should do this next week because I want to make sure you get good resources, is give you like 3 different people who argue the text and their position well. Because I can give you a couple, but they would be from my perspective. There's a local flood people. There's some good ones out there. There's one I saw, and then there's a lot of global flood, and then there's variations in between. So I would have to look at some, but there are some really good debates, inter-Christian debates that I've seen, but I'd have to go back and find them.
Yeah, I mean, most of my young Earth people that I know, when it comes to there's two argumentations that go on with how animals would get to where they were going. One was it was Pangea, and it was all one continent, and so all the animals spread out. And then it was the time of Peleg that God broke it apart in this hydrological explosion. Obviously, I think there's Christians who are geologists that they'll all debate and disagree on that. Another young Earth vision has nothing to do with all of it being Pangea, but that the flood created the ice age, and so much water was trapped in the ice that it was lowering the levels of the ocean, so that the vast majority of all land masses were connected, if not all of them. And so animals still had the potential to get wherever they needed to go, and even down to Antarctica, so that even the giant spawn and stuff down there could happen. So that's another one that some will argue. Where you put all those animals, it's a lot of animals. They would argue, they're babies, but some of these, how many rat generations you're going to get within that time? There's a lot of conversations, but again, that wasn't really what they were thinking about. They were really thinking about that this was a special group of people spared to reset civilization. And in fact, behind all of the ancient stories that are out there is that same concept, that these people come back after this flood and reset civilization. And so whether it's Quetzalcoatl from the
was that Mayans and Aztecs?
From the Mayans and the Aztecs, even as far back as the Olmecs, Olmecs would know him as Kukulkan, or whether it's the
Enuma Elish from the Babylonian.
You have Uphanutad, or whatever his name is.
Uphanashtu,
some weird name. And then you've got a Japanese version, you've got a Native American version, you've got a Chinese version, you've even got a Peloponnesian version of these stories. And what's weird to me is that all of them wind up as civilizations that have a tendency to build large mountains. We call them pyramids, icy mountains.
Ziggurats.
You got ziggurats, step pyramids, icy mountains. And at the center of all these mountains, as we dig down into the center, are springs, freshwater springs. Well, that goes back to an Eden picture, because Eden was a mountain where 4 waters are rushing out. At the end in Revelation, the city of Jerusalem is this mountainous giant city that the floodwaters are coming out of. So there is such deep connections to the biblical concepts that somewhere, we can argue this, that there was somewhere at some point some great flood catastrophe that either set off a whole bunch of new catastrophes that reminded everybody of that one, or that these are the stories that were spread through these civilizations post-Babel with these different languages.
When they were spread from each other.
When all remembering this one event where this Noah and his family reset civilization, and they put it in their own contexts. So when you think of those kinds of concepts, I think that what you're getting to is either they're all different civilizations and there's a whole bunch of weird Noahs out there, and which is some people's viewpoints, not Christians, but I argue that these are all the memory of a single civilization prior to Babel that remembers this, and it was pretty far back from Babel that the flood was, and Babel's far enough back that you get echoes of it in all these ziggurats and civilizations everywhere. It's kind of the first attempt to make a heaven on earth city, and so I think even that goes even further back. So we're talking, in my reasoning, even if you're a young earther, you need to abandon the chronological, like this begat this guy, so this begat, so that those genealogies are not locked. I don't know any scholar, any true Hebrew scholar that thinks the genealogies, I mean, there are probably some out there, but there are very few now, but that don't see the gaps in the genealogies.
You see them within the text of the Bible.
So there are even young earthers who are like, the earth may not be 6,000, the earth can be hundreds of thousands of years old, but this story still fit in that zone. And so, and I have a tendency to hold to more of, there's a larger gap in all these, and that what we're eating is a truncated amount of time of the great moments that are the great, like, psychic like explosions that hit people's mind, hit civilization as humanity fell and rejected God again and again and again. So
this kind of goes into the next question as well from Debbie, Genesis 9:20, and it's kind of like God did this reset. Man is so sinful that I regret the day that I made them, and I am going to, save this righteous family and put them on an ark, and we're going to start over and reset humanity. And then Noah's family says, you know what? We're going to reset sin. We're going to go ahead and start as soon as we get off the ark. Yep. Which brings me to this next question.
With the fruit.
Yeah. And I mean, to me, that just goes to show.
It was the fruit of the vine.
That just goes to show the depravity of man, right? Because I think that if people could sit here right now and go, well, if Christ came back and judged the earth right now and then left it, where all sin is dealt with, I mean, although we all know that means generation, a sinless life. And it's like, no, we would go right back to sinning again, because we just saw the judgment of God. And now Noah's family is going to enter into this. So Genesis 9:20 says that when, after they landed and they built a tent and Noah became drunk. So why was it such a big deal that his son saw him naked? So in Genesis 9, it talks about Noah getting drunk and his sons seeing his nakedness. So why is that such a big deal?
There's a couple things here in the text that I want to allude to. A lot of people, this might be a little odd for some people, so I'm going to take you to Leviticus here, Leviticus 18. So if you're in Leviticus 18, 6 through 8, there's this euphemism that we don't use, but that they used in the Bible text. And the first time it's used here is here in Leviticus 18. Leviticus is talking about, in ancient Near Eastern cultures, a man's wife was considered part of his household and honor, and a disgrace to a man's wife, or as equivalent disgrace was to the man himself. And so in Leviticus 18, you have, none of you shall approach any of those of his close relatives to uncover his nakedness. You're like, oh, well, that seems like we're just uncovering the nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother, which is your mother, which you shall not uncover the nakedness of her. And then you jump down to verse Leviticus 20:11, and it says, if a man lies with his father's wife, he has uncovered his father's nakedness. So it's linking both of them shall surely be put to death. There is a blood which is upon them. And so it is saying, like, this phrase, uncovering of the nakedness, has been around, and that's what exact same term that they're using here in Genesis. And it means that usually has to do with the sexual nature of some kind. And it's a way of saying, like, don't sleep with your family. Don't sleep with your mother or your brother or your sister.
So let me read it again. Noah, a man of the soil, began to plant a vineyard. I'm reading from the Net version. When he drank some of the wine, he got drunk and uncovered himself. And that is the hit they say means to uncover oneself, to be uncovered. Noah became overheated because of the wine. And so that implies that, okay, he's naked. So inside the tent, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two. And so this is where it gets into like, well, who's he really having sexual relations with? It could very easily imply that they both were overheated and hey, they went and fainted in the tent. And so Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers who were outside. Shem and Japheth took the garment, placed it on their shoulders, then walked in backwards and covered up their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned the other way, so they did not see their father's nakedness. So, if this is, in one case, it's just they viewed it naked and now all mankind sinned. It's like, okay, that's weird. Or you want to explain the rest how this can work.
Or this is someone having sex. So there's the first thing. It could be Noah and his wife. They're naked because they're in a situation where they got drunk and were with each other. And then the son sees this and engages in a sexual relationship with either his mother or with his father present and his mother there. And then you have later on, because there's a curse going on here. And so what a lot of people would read this as, and a lot of commentary has read this as the son goes in and sleeps with his mother, and that's why his line is cursed. And then when the father awakes and finds out what had happened, there's a curse placed on that part of the family. And so most people interpret there's some kind of sexual activity going on here. because of the phrase used, the uncovering of his father's nakedness is often referred to as your spouse, which makes more sense with the text, or you yourself in the middle of an act of doing something sexual. So I don't know if that explains it quite clear. What do you think, Greg?
No, I mean it's I lean more towards that. It's tough to work all the language out totally, but there seems to be some implication of sexual impropriety. Why you would curse the youngest son only seems to be that
she was pregnant.
She was pregnant with him, and so it's weird. It's an odd text. It's definitely considered salacious enough that an entire lineage is going to be cursed. So.
And this isn't something that I came up with off the blue. There are many commentaries that talk about this particular phrase, and so what was probably going on here is sexual impropriety, and that's why in order to not cover up the shameful incident, the two children come in and just cover their parents, but the other son, he indulged. So,
all right. Well, I don't want to end this thing, but we are, and I just needed to ask you guys a question. So,
sure.
I just read where French fries weren't originally cooked in France. Do you know where they were originally cooked?
Sweden?
No.
Oil.
Greece.
Brent and his terrible jokes. Well, we didn't get out of here without one of those, but we're glad that you guys.
I'm glad we ended on that.
Yeah, that's actually much better. So thank you for the Greece reference.
You're welcome.
Anyway, so we're just glad that you did join us. I hope that you've enjoyed this Q&A session of our rabbit trail, and maybe you have some questions, brought up some questions. You want to do some follow-up? Let us know. Send us an email. You can send it to the email of rabbittrail@obcc.church. That's rabbit trail. Think rabbit and then capitalize the T. So there's two T's there. Trail @obcc.church. And we would love to hear from you. Otherwise, thank you guys for joining us. We hope that you have a great rest of your week.
Boom. Chocolate.
Bye.